Hearing his youngest daughter's heart-wrenching cries, Su Sanlang strode into the house. He reached out to hold her. Strangely, as soon as Su Xiaolu was in his arms, her cries subsided, but she still felt aggrieved. Her lively eyes were filled with tears as she pouted and whimpered, as if she was saying that she's aggrieved. Su Sanlang's heart melted. Simei, be good, Daddy is here. Let's not cry anymore. Su Xiaolu looked at Madame Zhao and then at Su Sanlang. Su Sanlang understood a little and said to Madame Zhao, Darling, have you not rested for a long time? Madame Zhao sighed. Sanlang, I thought that since I was going to be done soon, I let Sanmei coax her first. Su Sanlang looked at Madame Zhao with pain in his eyes. He said gently, Darling, I know what you're worried about. It's not cold yet. There's no need to be so anxious. You're not well. You have to rest well. Simei is sensible and feels sorry for you. Su Sanlang coaxed Su Xiaolu and placed her beside Madame Zhao. As expected, Su Xiaolu stopped crying. Su Sanmei said, Sanmei, keep an eye on your mother at home. If she refuses to rest, tell father. Su Sanmei nodded obediently. Yes, I'll listen to father and take good care of mother. Madame Zhao sighed helplessly. Although she was helpless, she said with a smile, Okay, I'll listen to you. Alright. Su Sanlang smiled warmly. That's better. With that, Su Sanlang called out to his two sons, Chong, Hua, wake up. Let's make breakfast and go to work. Su Chong and Su Hua nodded and got up quickly. Su Sanmei also got up to help cook. After breakfast, Su Sanlang took Su Chong and Su Hua up to the back of the house to turn the soil. Su Sanmei watched as Madame Zhao drank the medicine and helped to change Su Xiaolu's diaper. Then, she took the diaper out and went to wash it. When she was done, Su Sanmei went to catch insects to feed the chickens. Su Sanlang was watching from not far away. He watched as Su Sanmei diligently made another trip to the chicken pen. He couldn't help but wonder, how could there be so many insects by the well? However, he didn't have time to think about it. The old land was dry and overgrown. He spat into his red smooth palm and started to dig. In the afternoon, a silhouette carried a basket towards Su Sanlang's house. Su Sanlang saw the figure and recognized it as his little sister. Su Xiaoji, why are you here? Su Sanlang put down his hoe and came out of the land. Su Sanmei, who was catching bugs, looked at Su Xiaoji and smiled shyly. Hello, Aunt. Su Xiaoji smiled and said to Su Sanmei, Hey, Sanmei is so sensible. Then, Su Xiaoji looked at Su Sanlang with worry in her eyes. Third brother, how are you guys doing? Seeing that Su Xiaoji was about to cry, Su Sanlang smiled and waved his hand. Xiaoji, it's rare for you to come by. Come inside, drink some water and look at my little daughter. She's so beautiful. Su Xiaoji's heart ached when she saw how carefree Su Sanlang was, but she had no way to help. She followed behind Su Sanlang and said, Third brother, go back and apologize to our parents. Take the children home. Okay. Winter was always exceptionally cold. Her parents did not give much to her third brother at all. How was he going to get through this winter? Su Xiaoji did not dare to think about it. She knew that her third brother's family had suffered, but she still wanted to persuade them. It was better to suffer than die. Third brother, listen to me. Go back and apologize to your parents. I know you're sad, but think about the children. They'll be fine when they grow up. Su Xiaoji followed behind Su Sanmei and tried her best to persuade. Su Sanlang paused and said in a heavy voice, Xiaoji, let's not talk about that. Our family is doing well now. Don't worry about us. Live your life well. The determination in Su Sanlang's heavy voice made Su Xiaoji's heart tremble. The determination in Su Sanlang's heavy voice made Su Xiaoji's heart tremble. What could have possibly made her third brother completely give up on their parents? She knew Su Sanlang's personality. At this point, Su Xiaoji knew that there was no way to persuade him anymore. She followed Su Sanlang into the house and put down the basket. Third brother, this is a little gift from me for third sister-in-law. Su Xiaoji brought 40 eggs and 100 copper coins. Su Sanlang hurriedly declined. Xiaoji, take it back. Before Su Sanlang could finish, Su Xiaoji interrupted her and said, Third brother, if you don't accept this, it means that you don't want to acknowledge me as your sister. If it weren't for you back then, I wouldn't be where I am now. Although I'm not rich, my husband's family treats me well. If you hadn't stood up for me back then, I wouldn't be where I am now. Su Xiaoji recalled that 10 years ago, when she proposed marriage, Madame Wang and Old Master Su had chosen two families for her. One family gave her a lot of money for the betrothal gifts, but their family's atmosphere was not very good. The other family's background was average, but they were simple and good people. Madame Wang and Old Master Su were about to give her away to the family that offered more money for the dowry. It was Su Sanlang, her third brother, who had stood up against her parents and even beat up that family's son. He told their domineering mother, Madame Wang, that if he dared to marry his sister over, he would snatch her back. His attitude shocked Madame Wang and old Master Su. Hence, Su Xiaoji married into the family with an average family background in the end. Although she was not rich in the past 10 years, she led a good life. She was not cold nor hungry. Every time she thought about it, Su Xiaoji was filled with gratitude. Especially as she grew older, she understood how precious it was for Su Sanlang to protect her. Since Su Xiaoji had already said so, how could Su Sanlang reject her? He sighed. I'll take this money as a loan from you. I'll return it to you when I have money in the future. Su Xiaoji smiled. Sure, as long as third brother accepts it, she thought. Looking at the renovated straw hut, Su Xiaoji sighed. Su Sanlang knew what she was worried about. He smiled and said, don't worry, I'll flip the soil and sow some vegetables in a few days. In the back mountain forest, I also set up a few traps that can catch wild animals. I caught some just a few days ago and sold them to buy cloth and cotton. Your third sister-in-law is cutting cloth to make clothes right now. With that, Su Sanlang brought Su Xiaoji into the house to take a look. Looking at the cloth, Su Xiaoji was relieved, but she still could not calm down. When Madame Zhao saw Su Xiaoji, she smiled and said, Xiaoji, you're here, thank you for coming to see us. Su Sanlang smiled and said, Xiaoji, sit and chat with your sister-in-law, I'll cook. With that, Su Sanlang left. Su Xiaoji sat down beside Madame Zhao and held her hand. Sister-in-law, what happened? Tell me, why did it end up like this? Even if she gave birth to another daughter, her parents would scold her, but it would all pass after a while. How did it get to the point where third brother's family was chased out? Su Xiaoji thought. Madame Zhao sighed and looked at the anxious and concerned Su Xiaoji. She told her the reason and said, Xiaoji, I was a disappointing wife. I didn't give birth to a son for your third brother. Father and mother couldn't tolerate Sime. They said that we had to either abandon Sime or leave. Su Xiaoji looked at Madame Zhao in shock. She could not believe it. Su Xiaolu was lying on the bed and had long since woken up. She did not cry or make a fuss. Her bright eyes looked at Su Xiaoji curiously, as if sizing her up. Looking at her obedient niece, Su Xiaoji felt her heart ache. She understood. Madame Zhao added, and I also hurt my body because of Sime. I can't have another child in the future. Actually, this was the root of the problem. If Su Sanlang was willing to be an obedient son, old Master Su and Madame Wang could tolerate, as long as he was obedient. Abandoned his daughter and Madame Zhao, the woman who could not give birth to a son, died. It was Su Sanlang who couldn't bring himself to let her down, so he'd rather bring his family out to spend their lives alone, even if they might all starve and freeze to death this winter. Su Xiaoji had indescribable emotions in her heart. When she saw Madame Zhao's tearful eyes, her heart ached. She reached out to wipe away Madame Zhao's tears and said, Sister-in-law, don't think too much. It's not your fault. My third brother is a real man for doing this. He's indeed the brother I admire. Su Sanlang was loyal, so he could not abandon his wife and daughter. Just as he stood up for his sister back then, Su Xiaoji took out a silver bracelet from her sleeve and handed it to Madame Zhao. Sister-in-law, I can't help you much. This is the only thing I can give you. Please accept it. When your family is in a pinch, use it. After you get through this year, everything will get better. Madame Zhao was shocked and touched. She wanted to refuse, but she couldn't get the words out. She only cried and said, Xiaoji, thank you. Su Xiaoji also shed tears. She smiled and said, you'll definitely get through it. Madame Zhao nodded heavily. Su Xiaoji wiped her tears away. All right, don't cry, you're still in confinement. Both of them wiped their tears. Su Xiaoji looked at Su Xiaolu and realized that the little girl seemed to have been looking at her. Her lips pursed. There were tears in her lively eyes, but she didn't cry out. Su Xiaoji reached out gently and said, Sime, be good and let me hug you. Okay. Su Xiaolu burst into tears. Ever since Su Xiaoji came, she had been paying attention to this aunt of hers. She had also thought that her aunt might be here to cause trouble, but she had miscalculated. Her aunt was here to help them. How precious it was. Su Xiaolu was touched and remembered this gesture in her heart. Su Xiaoji picked up Su Xiaolu. She was afraid that the little girl would cry, but to her surprise, after she picked her up, the tears in Su Xiaolu's eyes gradually disappeared. She even opened her mouth and smiled at her. Su Xiaoji was pleasantly surprised. Sime, you're so obedient. You seem to understand us. Su Xiaoji looked at Madame Zhao with a hint of pain in her eyes. Madame Zhao smiled and said, Sime is indeed very obedient. She doesn't cry much or make a fuss. It's not tiring to take care of her at all. Su Xiaoji's eyes were gentle. That's good. That's good. The next time I come to see you, Sime will have to recognize me. Su Xiaoji sighed. She only returned to her parents' house once a year. This time, she had estimated that Madame Zhao would be giving birth soon. However, she did not expect that in less than a year, there would be such a drastic change. Since they could not go back, she wished from the bottom of her heart that her upright third brother could live a safe and healthy life with his family. Madame Zhao also looked at Su Xiaolu in Su Xiaoji's arms and sighed slightly. Yes, next time you come, Simei might even be able to walk. Su Xiaoji smiled and looked into Su Xiaolu's bright eyes. She could not help but say, our Simei must be very good looking when she grows up. She looks like third brother, but her skin is fair like yours. Such a cute child. Su Xiaoji could not accept nor understand why her mother was so vicious and could not tolerate this baby. Su Xiaolu smiled often and almost melted Su Xiaoji's heart. She could only feel sorry that she did not have money and could not help her third brother's family. After returning Su Xiaolu to Madame Zhao, Su Xiaoji said, sister-in-law, take Simei to rest. I'll help you make some clothes. I'm fast and can help you sew a rough foundation. Before Madame Zhao could say no, Su Xiaoji had already gone to pack the cotton and cloth. Madame Zhao felt a lump in her throat and said, all right, thank you. Su Xiaoji waved her hand and said nothing. Su Sanlang was cooking with Su Sanmei. Su Chong and Su Hua returned after packing up the grass and roots that Su Sanlang had dug out. The two of them entered the house and looked at Su Xiaoji curiously. Su Xiaoji's expression was gentle as she waved at the two of them. When the two of them walked over, Su Xiaoji patted their heads and asked, Chong, Hua, do you remember me? Last year, during the New Year, I came to visit you. Su Chong and Su Hua nodded. Yes, you gave us candy. Su Xiaoji smiled and took out a small paper bag and handed it to the two of them. There are only 3 pieces left. Take them and share them with your sister. Everyone gets 1 piece. Understand? Su Chong and Su Hua did not know if they should take it. Before they could say anything, Su Xiaoji had already placed the sugar packet in their hands. Madame Zhao said gently, listen to Aunt. Go outside and share it with Sanmei. Su Chong and Su Hua's eyes lit up. Su Hua said clumsily, okay, thank you, Aunt. Su Chong also hurriedly said, thank you, Aunt. The two of them could not conceal their joy and had already gone out of the room together. Soon, Su Sanmei's happy shout came from the outer room. Thank you, Aunt. Su Sanlang's heart warmed. He said gently, go eat outside. Father will stay here. When we eat later, I will call for you. He had never bought candy for his 3 children. They had only tried them when Su Xiaoji returned to visit the family. Su Sanlang's heart sank and ached when he thought about how his eldest brother and second brother's children often had candy to eat in that house, and his children didn't even get to eat the dregs. The next time he caught prey, he would buy some candy for the 3 children. Su Sanlang kept this in mind. Su Sanmei took her 2 brothers outside to eat candy. This candy was very hard and sticky. Each of them only had a candy the size of a thumb. They held it in their mouths and let it slowly melt. After sharing the candy, Su Chong and Su Hua eagerly put it in their mouths. Su Sanmei quietly took a bite, then wrapped the rest and put it in her pocket. Big brother, second brother, let's have a bug-catching competition. Su Sanmei took Su Chong and Su Hua to catch insects to feed the chickens. With food to eat, the 2 chickens were very cheerful, but Su Sanmei realized that the hen had not come to eat. Instead, it was squatting motionless on the bundle of grass. Su Sanmei suddenly realized something. She quickly grabbed Su Chong and Su Hua and made a shushing gesture at them. She smiled and said, big brother, second brother, don't speak. Our hen is about to lay an egg. Su Chong and Su Hua had never seen this before. They carefully followed Su Sanmei and quietly squatted outside the chicken coop to watch. The hen was wary when laying eggs. The slightest movement disturbed it, but in the quietness, the hen quickly completed the process of laying an egg. Then, it jumped out of the chicken coop and ran towards Su Sanmei. A white egg was left in the chicken coop. Su Sanmei went in and carefully picked up the egg. Then, she said to her 2 brothers, let's go and tell father. Su Sanmei was very happy and didn't forget to turn back to the hen in the coop. You're awesome. I'll catch more worms for you to eat later. The egg was huge, like a reward. As soon as they entered the house, Su Sanmei smiled and said, father, look, there's another egg today. Su Sanlang was a little surprised. Ever since this chicken started laying eggs, it laid eggs every day. Moreover, they were relatively big. Compared to the eggs sent by Su Xiaoji, it was even more obvious. Su Sanlang took the egg and said with a smile, good child, your aunt sent over a basket of eggs. I'll cook poached eggs for you today. The rice was still mixed with corn, while the vegetables were dried and soaked. He cut a small piece of cured meat and cooked it. Then, he beat 6 eggs to make poached egg soup. Because Su Xiaoji was here, there were not enough bowls to eat with. Su Sanlang called Su Xiaozhi to eat. After scooping for the children, he carried Madame Zhao's food into the house. In just 2 hours, Su Xiaozhi had sewn the foundation of the 3 children's cotton clothes. Su Sanlang's heart warmed. Darling, it's time to eat. Our chicken laid another egg. Xiaozhi also brought a basket of eggs for you to eat. In the future, I'll cook an egg for you every day. Sanlang, don't worry about me. Go out and take care of Xiaozhi. Madame Zhao took the bowl and urged Su Sanlang to leave. She lowered her eyes so Su Sanlang could not see her tears. When Su Sanlang came out, he realized that Su Xiaozhi and the children had not eaten yet. Su Sanlang quickly went to get a bamboo bowl and scooped rice. He said, "Eat quickly." After Su Sanlang sat down, Su Xiaozhi smiled and said, all right, let's eat." Su Xiaozhi gave the poached eggs to the 3 children. Seeing that there was only one left in the bowl, she gave it to Su Sanlang without thinking. Su Sanlang quickly stopped her and said, "Xiaozhi, I don't eat eggs. If you don't eat them, I'll be angry." Su Xiaozhi had no choice. He knew that Su Sanlang was telling the truth. After dinner, Su Xiaozhi was about to leave when Su Sanlang took 2 eggs from the chicken at home and sent her out. He said, "Xiaozhi, I don't have anything to return to you. These 2 eggs were laid by our chicken at home. They're not worth much. Take them back as a good bet." Su Xiaozhi did not refuse. She took the egg and said, "Third brother, I'll go back then. I'll visit you guys again next year." "Okay, stay safe," Su Sanlang said with a smile. After sending Su Xiaozhi away, Su Sanlang continued to flip the soil with Su Chong and Su Hua. Meanwhile, Su Sanmei was taking care of Madame Zhao and Su Xiaolu in the house. Su Xiaozhi carefully put the eggs away. The eggs in her hand were equivalent to 3 ordinary eggs. She thought about how when she came, she saw Su Sanmei catching insects to feed the chickens, and how Su Chong and Su Hua were helping to rake the ground and clearing weeds. The heavens would definitely treat this family well. When Su Xiaozhi returned to the Su family, she realized that the door was already closed. No one seemed to be at home. Su Xiaozhi's heart turned cold. She went forward and knocked on the door. She shouted, "Father, Mother, are you at home?" No one responded to her. However, the sound of her nephews playing in the house told Su Xiaozhi that there were people at home, but she was not welcome in the house. This was only because she insisted on visiting the 3rd brother's family. Before going, Madame Wang said, "If you dare to go, don't ever come back again." Su Xiaozhi did not take it seriously, but at this moment, looking at the tightly shut door, she knew that what Madame Wang said was true. Su Xiaozhi's heart ached a little, but she did not regret doing that at all. Since her parents were so ruthless and refused to let her in, she would not force them to. Su Xiaozhi shouted again, "Father, Mother, it's getting late. I'll go home first." With that, Su Xiaozhi left. As soon as she left, Madame Wang opened the door and splashed out a ladle of water. Accompanying it were Madame Wang's merciless cursing. "You scourge, don't ever come back. If I had known this would happen, I would have drowned you to death back then. Like that family, you're also a piece of trash. Get lost." Su Xiaozhi's back trembled. She still did not look back and quickened her pace. When Madame Wang saw Su Xiaozhi leave, she was not appeased at all. She placed her hands on her hips and stomped her feet as she said fiercely, "Once it snows, I'll see how that room full of rotten things can survive. I'm so angry." After cursing them, Madame Wang turned around fiercely and lost her temper at Madame Li and Madame Zhou. Look, see if you can bring all the food here by looking. Hurry up and get to work. Whoever dares to slack off, get out of this house." Madame Li and Madame Zhou were in a difficult position and did not dare to challenge Madame Wang directly. However, they were secretly cursing her to die in their hearts. Without Madame Zhao at home, Madame Wang vented her anger on the 2 of them. In the past, they did not feel it, but ever since the 3rd branch was split up, Madame Li and Madame Zhou had suffered quite a bit. Although they could not do anything about it, there was a lot of work to do at home, and it was tiring. They had to go to the fields as well. As for the cooking at home, Madame Wang and Madame Zhou's daughter took care of it. The hard work of the autumn harvest immediately made everyone feel tired. Madame Li and Madame Zhou carried their baskets on their backs and started chatting. "It will still be tough for a month or 2. It's so tiring. There's no mother-in-law in the entire southern mountain village who is more heartless than our mother." As Madame Li complained, she felt a wave of frustration in her heart. Madame Wang was both stingy and vicious. The moment she caught anyone, she would curse them viciously. It was infuriating to hear. Madame Zhou felt the same way. Isn't that so? She doesn't even want her own son and daughter. I wonder when such days will come to an end. Their only hope was for their sons to be successful in their studies. By then, Madame Wang would be old too. Madame Li sighed. At this moment, she was actually a little envious of Madame Zhao. She thought about how her 3 sons were all healthy and would definitely have a good life after being separated. She looked at Madame Zhou and said casually, "Right, I'm even a little envious of the 3rd sister-in-law." Madame Zhou smiled. She was not as stupid as Madame Zhao. When Madame Li said that, she knew exactly what Madame Li was up to. She was not stupid. Old Master Su was still in good health, and Madame Wang was not old yet. She would not dare to mention separating from the family unless she did not want to stay in this family anymore. Madame Zhou smiled and said, "Aya, sister-in-law, you can't say that. 3rd sister-in-law has a lot of difficulties too. Our lives are still better, don't you think so?" Madame Li chuckled. Hee, that's true." When Madame Zhou said that, she knew that she could not possibly use her to her own advantage. Madame Zhou was very clever. Both of them had their own plans, and neither spoke again. Although Madame Wang was detestable and they were all secretly cursing her to die, none of them could be happy if Madame Wang died now. If Madame Wang were to die now, old Master Su would definitely have to marry a widow soon. At that point, life would be even harder for them. Therefore, even if they hated her, they still hoped that she would just grow old quickly. As for the 3rd branch, Madame Zhao was no longer pressured by her mother-in-law. It was just that they might not be able to survive the winter in that dilapidated house. Perhaps the old house would collapse if the snow got too heavy in winter. Su Sanlang's family did not know about what happened to Su Xiaozhi. As soon as Su Xiaozhi left, Su Sanlang and his 2 sons continued to flip the soil, with Su Sanmei taking care of Madame Zhao. Su Sanlang did not have to worry. After Su Sanlang dug through the ground twice, he looked at the thick piles of grass and grass roots that had been cleared. Hard soil was difficult to dig, and if those grass roots weren't dug out, then nothing much would grow on this land. Since grass grew faster than grain, he had to dig up all the grass roots at once. At the end of the day, only a small plot of land had been sorted out, not even half an acre. After dinner and washing up, the children went to bed. Su Sanlang had just lied down when Madame Zhao touched the bloody blisters on his palm. Her heart ached. "Sanlang, let's take a break tomorrow." Su Sanlang smiled and said, "It's not a big deal. I'm in good health, so it's not a big deal. It's just that the ground is a little difficult to dig, but after I deal with it, I won't have to work so hard next year." Madame Zhao stroked the blisters and leaned against Su Sanlang, silently crying, "Sanlang, starting tomorrow, tell Sanmei not to pick up our eggs and let them hatch into chicks. If things move along fast, we can will chicks in October. If it's too cold by then, we can raise them in the house." Madame Zhao began to plan. As long as the eggs in the chicken coop reached a certain amount, the hen would no longer lay eggs, and it took 21 days for a nest of eggs to hatch. It was now August 18th. If nothing went wrong, a nest of chicks would be born in October. Su Sanlang had worked so hard for this family. How could she bear to let him work alone? How could she eat the eggs that were given to her? Su Sanlang nodded. "Sure, I'll listen to you. Thanks to Xiaozhi who sent the eggs, you'll have something to eat, so I'm not worried." Su Xiaozhi sent over 40 eggs and they ate 5 for lunch. There were still 35 left. Madame Zhao could eat 1 every day for a month and 5 days. It was just that the 3 children couldn't continue to eat eggs. They were sensible and would not cry if they could not eat them, but the thought of this made Su Sanlang feel sorry for them. When they had more hens laying eggs in the future, he would let his children eat eggs every day. Su Sanlang fell asleep as he thought about this. Madame Zhao knew that Su Sanlang was very tired and did not say anything else. She gently patted Su Xiaolu and soon fell asleep too. Beside Su Xiaolu was her 3rd sister. When Su Xiaolu woke up in the middle of the night, she secretly fed her spiritual spring water again. Early in the morning of August 19th, Su Sanlang went to check the traps. To his surprise, he caught 4 rabbits. The other traps did not trap anything, but neither were they destroyed. He carried the rabbits home and locked them up. The rabbits were in good spirits. He was too busy to go to town these few days, so he planned to make a big cage to keep the rabbits in first. Su Sanmei was delighted to see the rabbits. After breakfast, Su Sanmei took Su Chong and Su Hua to catch insects and pull grass to feed the rabbits. The grass at the place where she often washed diapers was green, perfect for rabbits. Madame Zhao was making clothes in the house and was very happy to hear that Su Sanlang had caught 4 rabbits. When she was feeding Su Xiaolu, she even sighed and muttered to herself, "The heavens love us." After Su Xiaolu was full, she spat out a bubble and smiled at Madame Zhao. Right now, she wasn't worried that this family would die of coldness or hunger. Since the insects that Su Sanmei had caught carried a tiny bit of spiritual energy, she wasn't worried that Su Sanlang's traps wouldn't be able to catch anything. The mountain was so big, if he couldn't catch them in this area, he could simply find another place to catch them. As for her, she only needed to eat and drink well. Every day, she would let her diligent third sister drink spiritual spring water. When her third sister's health improved, she would be able to catch more insects and work even harder. It was a virtuous circle. After Su Sanlang finished weaving the cage, he went into the house to see Su Xiaolu and teased her. "Mei, Daddy is going to flip the soil. Be good at home with Mother." Su Sanlang liked talking to Su Xiaolu, and Su Xiaolu gave him a smile. Blinking her eyes, she opened her mouth wide after laughing. "Daddy, go ahead, I'll send you my love," she thought. Su Sanlang looked at Su Xiaolu's face and felt a warmth in his heart. Every time he looked at his little daughter, it was as if he was provided with a lot of energy. After seeing his daughter, Su Sanlang said to Madame Zhao, "Darling, take your time making the clothes, don't be too tired, I'm going out." Madame Zhao smiled gently and nodded. Before Su Sanlang left, he said to Su Xiaolu, "Mei, help me take care of your mother. If your mother doesn't listen to me, tell me when I come back." Su Xiaolu opened her mouth and replied, "No problem," she thought. Madame Zhao did not know whether to laugh or cry. Her heart felt like it had been injected with honey, making her feel sweet. Su Sanlang had reached the back of the mountain to flip the soil. Su Chong and Su Hua helped clear the grass and weeds. In addition to helping Madame Zhao change and wash diapers, Su Sanmei also pulled grass and caught insects, taking care of the chickens and rabbits. From time to time, the 4 rabbits would make noises. Every time Su Sanmei came over with grass, the rabbits would be so scared that they didn't dare to move. Su Sanmei said softly, "Little rabbits, don't be afraid, eat quickly, eat your fill." Rabbits love to eat green grass. Su Sanmei even saw a rabbit pulling at the fur of another rabbit. She used a small stick to push it away and said, "Little Gray, you can't do this. If you pluck its fur, it won't look good." Her father would have to sell these rabbits. If they were bald, they might sell for less. Therefore, Su Sanmei had to stop the rabbits from plucking their fur. When she tried to stop it, the gray rabbit stayed away. However, the next time Su Sanmei looked over, it would be plucking the fur of other rabbits again. That night, Su Sanmei told Su Sanlang about what happened. "Father, let's separate the bad gray rabbit. He's plucked so much of their fur." Su Sanmei was a little angry. The rabbit didn't dare when she was watching, but as long as she looked away, the gray rabbit went to pluck other rabbit fur. Su Sanlang was also worried. If he wanted to raise them separately now, he wouldn't have any extra cages. Madame Zhao vaguely heard their conversation. She had a guess in her heart, so before Su Sanlang could say anything, she shouted from inside the house, "Sanlang, come inside, I have something to tell you." When Su Sanlang heard Madame Zhao's shout, he put the rabbit's problems aside and immediately turned around to enter the room. In the room, Madame Zhao looked at Su Sanlang and said, "Sanlang, I might know what's going on with that rabbit, but I'm not too sure if it's true. I just heard from others that when rabbits are about to give birth, they would pluck fur to make a nest. That rabbit might be about to give birth to a bunny." Su Sanlang was surprised. "So what should we do?" Su Sanmei followed him into the room and listened quietly. When she heard that it might be giving birth to a bunny, she was a little excited. She said, "Father, let's raise it. This way, we'll have a lot of rabbits in the future. I can pull a lot of grass for the rabbits to eat." Su Sanlang was a little surprised too. If they had a nest of little rabbits, wouldn't they have a big group of rabbits in the future? "Sanlang, whether there is or not, let's raise that rabbit separately first. It doesn't matter if there's no cage. Use the basket to cover it first." There was also light in Madame Zhao's eyes. Although she was unsure, the thought of it made her feel very good. Su Sanlang nodded. "Okay, whatever you say." When Su Sanlang went out to separate the 4 rabbits, he specially weighed rabbits in his hand. The gray rabbit that could possibly be pregnant was heavier than the other rabbits. Moreover, it was fierce. It even kicked its legs when he picked it up. Su Sanlang laughed as he separated it, perhaps because they had expectations. The family was in a good mood. They ate their rough meals happily. Su Sanlang thought that they could not afford to eat the cured meat every day, so most of the time, he cooked dry vegetables to eat. He used water to boil vegetables with poached eggs and pretended that there was meat. The food was not good, but all 3 children enjoyed it. They chewed slowly as if they were eating delicious delicacies. Su Sanlang thought to himself that life would get better. The next morning, Su Sanlang specially made a new cage for the rabbit. Su Sanmei brought her 2 brothers and caught the insects for Su Sanlang to put in the traps. After doing all this, Su Sanmei brought her 2 brothers to pluck grass and feed the rabbits. When Su Sanlang returned from checking the traps, he was carrying another dead pheasant. Su Chong and Su Hua surrounded him and watched eagerly. They didn't ask, but their eyes were clearly asking, "Father, are we eating that?" Su Sanmei had the same question. If it died, Should he sell it or eat it? Susan Lang seemed to see the children's doubts and said with a smile, "This pheasant is dead. If we try to sell it to the city people, they'll think it's not fresh. Let's boil water and clean it up. I'll make chicken soup for you guys tonight." Yay! Su Chong and Su Hua were overjoyed. Susan Lang patted the 3 children. This pheasant weighed 4 catties, and even after removing its internal organs, it weighed nearly 3 catties. He chopped it into small pieces and stewed half of it. As the chicken simmered, Susan Lang went to flip the soil. The fragrance of the chicken soup was so strong that Su Sanmei felt like she was floating. When she went into the house to help Madame Zhao change Su Xiaolu's diaper, Su Sanmei even sniffed and teased Su Xiaolu. "Su Sanmei, do you smell it? This is meat. It's a pity that you're still young. Otherwise, I would have fed it to you." Madame Zhao smiled and said, "It smells so good." Su Sanmei nodded seriously. Yes, it smells so good. I've never smelled anything like it. Never had anything like it either," she thought, perhaps remembering the bad times. Su Sanmei lowered her eyes. Madame Zhao sighed and reached out to stroke Su Sanmei's hair. "When the chicks hatch in the future, we'll eat chicken once a month." Su Sanmei looked up at Madame Zhao with a smile in her eyes. She nodded. "Okay." Su Xiaolu kicked her legs happily. She was free whenever they changed her diapers every day and had the chance to move around more. After changing the diaper, Su Sanmei pinched Su Xiaolu's little hand and pressed it against her face. Madame Zhao said, "Be careful, Simei might scratch you." Su Sanmei leaned against Su Xiaolu and said with a smile, "No, Simei won't scratch me. Simei smells so good too. She's sweet like the candy aunt gave me." Speaking of candy, Su Sanmei hadn't finished eating the piece from yesterday yet. Yesterday, she didn't have time to take it out. Su Sanmei took out a paper bag from her pocket and opened it. She handed the candy to Madame Zhao. "Mother, eat this." Madame Zhao was caught off guard and was almost moved to tears. She held it in with great effort and said in a choked voice, "My dear, why would mother eat candy? Hurry up and eat it yourself." Su Sanmei shook her head. "I want mother to eat it. It will nourish your body." Su Sanmei looked at Madame Zhao. Over the past few days, Madame Zhao's complexion had improved a lot, but she was still very afraid that Madame Zhao would become as pale as the day she gave birth to Simei. Su Sanmei would never forget the strong smell of blood that day. It was also at that moment that she suddenly understood what it meant to die. She knew that if her mother died, she would no longer have a mother. She did not want to be without a mother. Su Sanmei stuffed the candy into Madame Zhao's mouth and got up to take the diapers out to wash them. Madame Zhao held the candy in her mouth, and tears flowed down her cheeks. She sighed and gently squeezed Su Xiaolu's little hand. As she wrapped her up, she said, "Sim, God is so good to me. I met your daddy and had such sensible children. I must take care of my body so that I can watch you grow up and marry a good person." Su Xiaolu looked at Madame Zhao closely and smiled at her. She definitely would. When she grew up, she would contribute to the family. She would personally choose a good partner for such a good third sister. As for her 2 silly brothers, if they were cured, they would naturally have a good marriage. If they couldn't be cured, she would raise them for the rest of her life. She will be a doctor in the future. Her 2 brothers could be her assistants and help with the drying of medicine. They could live a good life on their own. After being wrapped up by Madame Zhao, Su Xiaolu began to fall asleep. She was still a baby at this point, so she should sleep obediently. Seeing that Su Xiaolu had fallen asleep quickly, Madame Zhao leaned over and kissed Su Xiaolu's forehead. "Simei, you're so obedient. Sleep well. I'll make clothes for your father, brothers, and sister." Madame Zhao quietly made clothes in the house. While Su Sanmei washed the diapers, the chicken was cooked. She put off the fire and let the soup slowly simmer on the stove. Then, she ran out again to pull grass and catch insects to feed the chickens and rabbits. As the sky gradually darkened, Su Sanlang looked at the half-acre of land he had dug and felt a sense of accomplishment.